I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Her name is Dawn Davis. She's a tribal person belonging to the membership of the, I don't know how to say this name, I'll let her say, Shoshone in Idaho. And so she's also a student who has done a master thesis about the conservation of peyote. So she's a woman coming from her own tribal background that decided to do a master to address a topic that is kind of controversial and taboo. She just published a contribution of her presentation in our Chacruna site, which I invite you to look at. And thank you very much for coming, Dawn.
Thank you. Good morning, hello. Sounds like it's going to be a tough crowd. All right, so before I begin, I'd like to thank MAPS and the Beckley Foundation, along with Psychedelic Science Organization, and Bia Labate and Brad Burge for inviting me to share my story with you. I thank you all for attending today, and that we have the next 30 minutes in this space to share and talk about peyote. As Bia mentioned yesterday in our welcoming presentation, it's not only great to have Indigenous voices present here, but that Indigenous voices are discussing Indigenous topics and discussing Indigenous issues. So with that, I wanted to first share a photo of my family, my husband Cleve and my daughter Liliana. This photo was taken in our homelands in southeast Idaho because before anything, I'm a mother and I'm a wife. So I wanted to acknowledge and thank my husband Cleve, wherever he's sitting, for his support and his continued support with my research and willingness to help me in any way that he can, including collaboration on the R coding for this presentation. Appreciation to my daughter Liliana too. She's been one of my biggest supporters, continues every day to encourage me that my work in peyote is important. Without their love and their support of these two, my educational endeavors and my goals would be non-existent. So as Bia mentioned, my name is Dawn Davis, and I am a member of the Shoshone tribes of Fort Hall, Idaho. It's where I make my home. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Idaho, where I'm a water resources major. I'm funded as an NSF IGERT fellow, and also a PNM Cosmos AGAP and iSTEM scholar. Though I am a student and a tribal member, and I'm also a member of the Native American Church, I do not speak on behalf of any of these entities. I only speak on behalf of myself, and I want to make that very clear. So my cultural teachings have taught me that humans and non-humans have an equal, that humans and non-humans have an equal right to exist, and that we are part of nature. We are not separate from it. So my work in peyote preservation and sustainability was the result of my master's thesis from the University of Arizona. I began with an idea that there was something wrong with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, specifically regarding peyote, and it was my responsibility to fix it. That was just the beginning of my story. As a lifelong member of the Native American Church, I became aware of diminished peyote size while in ceremony, and I began to wonder what might be that it might be somehow endangered. So I decided to pursue this research because after years of recognizing for myself that there was a peyote concern, I began graduate studies focusing on the status of peyote in regard to the laws and regulations that were applied to it. However, I quickly realized the issue was much deeper and more personal than that. Because I was raised in a traditional Native American home by my grandparents, I knew that studying something as sacred as our peyote medicine in a university setting would not only be sensitive, but it's controversial. It's a very controversial subject. So I talked with my grandparents and I asked them what they thought about it, how they thought my research would be perceived by other peyotists, because I'm still considered quote unquote young. I'm a woman, and I'm also a light-skinned Native American. So I was already faced with obstacles. Despite that, my grandparents were very encouraging. They gave me their blessing, and I continued on with my research. Peyote in my home is not considered a drug, a hallucinogen. It's not even considered an entheogen. It's simply called medicine. It's a plant that I've had a relationship with my entire life, and it's a plant worthy of protecting for myself, my children, my grandchildren, and for the plant itself. After coming to the realization that peyote is becoming endangered primarily due to human causes, my research began an entirely different journey. Initially, I struggled with disassociating myself personally from the medicine, but I found solace in attempting to see the world through the eyes of peyote. It has life, it feeds the soul of its believers, and it has the right to grow wildly in its native habitat. As of 2010, peyote was recognized by the Natural Resources Conservation Service as a plant of cultural concern, and it was considered endangered at the local level. Mexico categorized it as a subject of special concern also in 2010, but peyote has been a conservation concern since 1976. Because peyote has had a long history of bureaucracy, preservation efforts needed to be addressed as a bottom-up approach from peyotists directly. I also felt that amending the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was not only going to be difficult to impossible, but that addressing change in that manner was too Western of a thought for Native American people. It's more important now than ever for Native American church members and peyotists to work together to develop an indigenous approach to preserving the peyote sacrament for future generations. The approach should definitely include input from indigenous peoples whose homelands are included in the peyote gardens, such as the Cuyotecans, the Lipan Apaches, the Huichol, the Tarahumara, who have been using peyote since time immemorial. The input from indigenous peoples is vital for providing local and long-term environmental observations that can guide adaptive management that has potential to be more acceptable to indigenous people and result in sustainable use of the medicine. What is currently known about peyote threats to the habitat include root plowing, oil development, disturbance from feral hogs, ex-urban development, and development from wind farms. Population threats include harvesting using improper techniques from peyote distributors, the high demand for peyote both legally and illegally, and the increase in narcotourism, particularly in the southern habitat. So the peyote habitat is referred to, as many of you may know, as the Peyote Gardens. It's considered a revered and spiritual landscape. Those who travel there to acquire medicine consider this a pilgrimage and a blessing to have the opportunity to acquire their medicine directly and return to their homelands with it. While conducting my research, I was asked by one of my interviewees what my experience was like. I was embarrassed to tell them that I had not yet been there. Though Vine Deloria Jr. had written in God is Red, Indians who have never visited certain sacred sites nevertheless know of these places from the community knowledge, and they intuit this knowledge to be an essential part of their being. Growing up, I had heard my paternal grandfather, who I called Dogo, talk about his visit to the gardens and how he had gone out to collect peyote, telling me it took him hours before he found his first button. They were hiding, he had said, but as soon as he saw the first one, he said it was like they all just showed themselves to me. I knew that it was a place that I would eventually experience. I just didn't know when, and I was honestly afraid of this space and the power that it has manifested in my mind just from my ceremonial experiences. So when my daughter and I made our trip there in the spring of 2011, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. We met Mr. Salvador Johnson, who is the individual in the far bottom right, who is a peyotero. We met him at his home in Miranda City, and he took me out what he called the ranch. It's a patch of land in Stark County that he leased from a landowner. We had great discussions about his experience as a peyotero, his harvesting techniques, his struggles and his role as a peyotero. After driving for a while, we finally stopped in what felt like the middle of nowhere. We began walking, and at several times during this walk, I lost Salvador and the creosote, and the height and the width of these things was very impressive. I wasn't expecting that. And after searching for peyote, and I was hoping also not to hear any rattlesnakes or any other creatures in the brush. It seemed like forever, before I found Salvador, because he had been a ways in front of me. But he had yelled out to me if I'd found any. And I said, no, have you? And He laughed and he said, a few. So I remember being a bit envious at that point. I was determined more than ever that I was going to find my own peyote. And after a while, looking on the ground, everything began to look like peyote. Everything on the ground was clusters of peyote. Might have been the Texas sun beating on me, but peyote was everywhere. So I felt like a starving hunter trying to find my prey. And I caught up with Salvador, and he's standing under a creosote with a shovel, and he says, look here. And I go over and I look, at what he had found, and I see, gray limestones and, of course, tons of peyote. But then I realized, wow, there really is peyote. And I was starstruck. I fell to my knees, and I wanted to touch it, and I wanted to dig it out of the ground, but I wanted to get a closer look, but mainly, I wanted to touch it, and I wanted to feel it, but I wanted to also take a photo. So I remember it was cool to the touch. It was very soft, and it was a spiritually moving moment for me to make that connection between this plant in the ground and the medicine that I've had in my home in a glass jar. The medicine I'd seen in peyote all these years came from this space growing wildly. As we walked some more, they were finally showing themselves to me, just like they had for my dogo approximately 40 years ago. Peyote was growing wildly in their native habitat, as they should continue to be, in my opinion. On our drive back to his home, I asked Salvador how many Native American church members he's taken out into the gardens in his 30-plus years as a peyotero, and he said 1. And I was shocked. I really couldn't believe that, and I said, well, who was it? And he said, well, it was you. He said, you. And I said, this can't be. I honestly didn't know what to say. Because I realized at that point that there was a disconnection between peyotes and the peyote habitat, and that this was actually occurring. So I also truly understood at that moment the pivotal role peyoteros served to Native American church members and peyotes across the nation. With only 3 licensed dealers, the relationship with peyoteros have remained key since about 1870. It may be even earlier than that. They're key to maintaining the access between peyote and Texas landowners. This relationship has been cultivated by Native American church members. However, maintaining permits with the Texas Department of Public Safety is becoming increasingly difficult, and even more so for individuals who are trying to break into the peyote business. Currently, under the Texas Department of Public Safety rules and regulations, one of the major responsibilities of a peyote dealer is to ensure that proper sales records are maintained and that every peyote transaction is accounted for. No requirements for proper harvesting techniques, harvestable crown size, or harvest limits are being implemented. However, the Texas Department of Public Safety has recently made several significant changes, including a fine for improper harvesting and relieving peyoteros of the responsibility to submit annual sales records. While conducting my master's thesis, interviews were conducted between 2009 and 2011 with various tribally affiliated Native American church members and 1 peyotero. The common theme resulted in an apparent lack of knowledge regarding any type of peyote depletion. Those interviewees listed in red, however, held some knowledge of at least 1 type of depletion occurring in the peyote habitat. This information is reflective of the disconnection between peyotes and the peyote habitat. Educating and informing peyotes on the current state of the peyote gardens is not only critical for sustainability, but it's imperative that a reconnection to the land is made and that traditional ecological knowledge can be discussed and implemented. Where 80 to 90% of the peyote habitat exists in Mexico, it is imperative that peyotes begin to build dialogue and work collaboratively with the indigenous peoples of Mexico to acquire the traditional ecological knowledge that they employ among their own sacred peyote spaces. Though the Huichole of Mexico are experiencing an influx of narcotourism within their own sacred spaces, it's a crucial time for the northern peyotes and southern peyotes to come together in solidarity of the sacred medicine and devise a sustainability plan based on traditional ecological knowledge in the reverence of the peyote plant to sustain its wild habitat. This graph depicts an annual sales record of peyote from 1974 through 2016, as received from the Texas Department of Public Safety. Each dot marks an individual year, with the blue line representing the number of peyote buttons and the red line representing revenue earned. Though there are no records available from 1975 through 1984, I've chosen to display them on this chart because I believe that it still contains vital data. So what does this graph tell us? Or better yet, what kind of questions or hypotheses can be made from this graph? What this graph tells me is that there is a parallel trend in revenue earned and buttons sold. Pay attention to the trend lines over time and not individual points. So from 1986, if I can show you here, through 2016, there's a clear decline in the number of peyote buttons. Does this mean that wild populations are also declining? To answer this question, we need population-level field data. From 1998 to 2013, an increase in revenue is occurring. I'll just go like this so it looks like I'm pointing at something. In other words, it appears that a decrease in supply is made resulting in an increase In other words, it appears that a decrease in supply is maybe resulting in an increase in demand. From 2013, both the revenue and number of buttons sold are in decline. This could be related to many things. Less demand for peyote, perhaps peyote may have been overpriced. What this graph does not address is the size of the peyote buttons. It is safe to say that in 1974, peyote buttons were significantly larger than they are today. Yet in 2016, the number of buttons sold was less than that of 1974. So does this mean that there was less of a demand, or there were fewer peyotists purchasing peyote? Was there not enough peyote available due to the land leases, or was there a lack of harvest employees? It's difficult to interpret what this trend is saying without further research. Please keep in mind that this is only a record of legal peyote buttons sold and does not obviously reflect any illegal transactions. Due to the Texas Department of Public Safety's rules and regulation changes, 2016 may possibly be the last year that peyote data will be available. I think we can agree that this quantifiable information is valuable and should continue to be conducted, as well as monitoring of the average button size sold, as size can be used as a proxy for sustainable harvest. Though some recent regulation changes have been made, as I mentioned, there are still concerns on what is considered a harvestable size. Scientist Dr. Martin Terry has mentioned in several of his studies that a sustainable size is approximately 2.5 inches or a growing period of 5 years. According to my sources, regulation changes were mostly developed through consultation and input from non-Indigenous people who are not members of the Native American Church or peyotists. I would hope that the Texas Department of Public Safety would increase their scope to include more Indigenous people, such as a committee of elders or any future changes in the regulation. Again, it's important to include Indigenous people on matters related to environmental management. Traditional ecological knowledge, or what is known as TEK, is the environmental knowledge, resource management practices, related social institutions, and worldview of local Indigenous people that has been passed down through generations over many years. TEK likely offers the only viable solution to guide adaptive management and shape human-environment interactions. However, TEK has been used and continues to be quickly categorized, quarantined, and wrote off as being unfeasible by the non-Indigenous powers that be. Nonetheless, we need to pursue documenting and compiling TEK on peyote harvesting practices to develop a strategy to conserve peyote in its natural environment for future generations. It is my opinion too much emphasis has been placed on Western developed ideas for conservation. For example, top-down legislation, which often results in a lengthy bureaucratic process that often results in oppression and continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples. On the other hand, incorporating traditional ecological knowledge may be more readily acceptable and understandable to the Indigenous people who utilize this sacrament for their spirituality. In my discussions with peyotists, greenhouse cultivation is a temporary solution to a much larger problem. It's not a sustainable solution to preservation of the peyote population, the wild peyote population, or the peyote habitat. In conclusion, to present this, I chose to present this not as an academic presentation, but as a story, because that's what it is. It's a journey. It hasn't ended, it's continuing to evolve. I was forced to step away from peyote research for many years, and during that time, peyote kept returning to my life, calling me. I prayed, asking what this meant, and there again, it kept showing itself to me. So I needed that time, but I also realized that so does the peyote. So here I am, hoping to be a voice for peyote, where peyotists like myself can be involved in meaningful consultation with the players that be in creating a sustainable plan using traditional ecological knowledge from northern and southern peyotists regarding the preservation of wild peyote in its native habitat. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, and it's really fabulous. I think this is a great example. I hope you inspire other people, and maybe you can find some generous donors that want to help support your PhD studies.
That would be awesome.
I would like to open for a few questions, and also say that Don's master thesis is available in our NAEP site. That's www.neip.info. We've just published it there. Do we have any questions? Come here. Yeah. Say your name. Sure. So we're filming, that's why we're here.
Thank you, Dawn.
Hi.
My name is Kira, and I am obviously a non-Indigenous woman, but also a conservationist and interested in protection of rare plants and sacred plants. And my question for you is, what is the suggestion that you have for me in a way that I could bring my skills to support an Indigenous-led conservation strategy? Who would I go to ask for help, for direction, and how to develop the relationships that I need to help support what you're doing?
Well, it's a great question, because that's the first time a non-Indigenous person has asked me. I'm not sure how to respond. It's great to hear that, and I think just in talking with Peyoteros and Native American church people, and even researchers that are involved in this, there are not many Native American people involved in peyote research, and that's because it's a controversial subject. It's very sensitive, and which is why when I've done my research, I've chosen to stay away completely from the ceremonial aspect of peyote. I focus just on the plant itself. And so I honestly don't know where to tell you, other than we can maybe begin a dialogue, and that's really the best I can tell you.
Thank you for offering that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You spoke a little about that. I would like to know if you can tell more about the sort of resistance that you find between your own family or community for wanting to do that work. Can you share more about that?
That's a touchy subject, and I might get emotional, so I might have to pass on responding to that. But it is a very, very sensitive subject, and when I was conducting my research, I believe that there was some misconceptions about the research that I was doing in peyote, and I believe that there were some individuals offended by my research, particularly because they felt that I was exposing the Native American church, which, as I mentioned, and if you read my master's thesis, you'll find that I don't discuss any of the ceremonial aspects of the church in my research at all. I've stayed away from that. Because as a member, that's not something that I want to expose. That's something I want to keep. I want to covet that. I want to keep it to myself and share it with my family. I don't want that to be exposed and exploited. So I think there was just some misconceptions, but it was very hard on me, and it was very disheartening to hear some of those comments that were said about the research without them actually reading my master's thesis. So mainly it was just misconceptions.
Hi, my name is Franz. I really
Hi.
appreciate your talk. Yeah.
Thank
My
you.
question is, what are some viable pathways for creating linkages between northern peyotists and southern peyotists to conserve peyote, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it's been a very slow process for me to do that. I've made very slow progress in that I'm still working on creating those links and developing those relationships. And it's like I mentioned very early on in my presentation that I think that I run into those issues sometimes because I'm not perceived as a person of maybe authority because I am a woman and because I'm considered young. I'm not an elder. And so I run into some of those kinds of issues. And so that's been a slow moving process for me. I have made some contacts across the border, but they're very, very small.
Good morning. My name's Paul,
Hi, Paul.
and I'm very curious about the problem of resistance to cultivation. Cultivation certainly is not an answer. Greenhouse managed gardens, but it seems to me like it may be a bridge to enhancing natural populations by increasing seed density. And I just wonder if you might comment on resistance to that concept within the Native American Church.
As I said, I can only speak for myself. I cannot speak on behalf of the church. But from what I've been shared, what people have shared with me, greenhouse cultivation is occurring. There's a lot of issues with actually having the quote-unquote federal permission to cultivate. And I believe that Native American people are looking at greenhouse cultivation as a temporary solution, but they're leaning on that very heavily when we're not looking at what we can do to preserve the wild habitat of the peyote population. We should be looking at how to preserve the wild peyote and not, for myself, again, I'm talking on behalf of myself, and not necessarily looking and leaning on greenhouse cultivation. We don't know what that's going to turn into, and it's not going to be sustainable. If we become completely dependent on that, we're allowing the wild populations to just be exploited by these issues of development, feral hogs. I mean, there's a ton of, issues that are occurring in Texas, oil development. Mining is occurring in Mexico, We want to preserve the native habitat and not necessarily look at greenhouse cultivation.
I'd like to remind everybody that the other third keynote speaker of our track is Sandro Iron Rope, and he's going to be speaking in the afternoon, and the content of his talk is peyote healing potentials and conservation issues, so we can continue this discussion there, hopefully. I thank Dawn once again.
Thank you.